Falling leaves settling on the roots is a deep-rooted traditional Chinese concept. It describes the desire of Chinese to be buried in their hometown after they passed away.
In mid-19th century, factors including wars, unstable economy, and natural disasters contributed to the poor living quality in China. Under the domination of Manchu government, China had become an impoverished country. Their living conditions became even worse after the outbreak of the First Opium War in 1842. In order to get rid of the down-and-out life, the Chinese are motivated to work overseas.
太平天國都係其中一個原因啦。咁係令到喺廣東地區唔少嘅即係嗰啲人民咧係離開家鄉嘅嚇，為咗即係避難啦。
Furthermore, due to the discovery of gold deposits in California and Australia, many Chinese were attracted to travel overseas to pan for gold. This was a golden opportunity for them to escape from poverty.
就係喺今日嘅三藩市嗰度咧，係發現到有金礦啊，咁需要大量嘅礦工去開採嘅。咁當時咧喺呢個地球上邊咧係可以勝任呢啲工作嘅咧，基本上最理想嘅就係即係華工啦。咁所以喺即係金礦開金礦呢個咁樣嘅咁大嘅引誘底下咧，咁好多華工都覺得即係都值得去試一試咁。咁另外
In China, numerous agencies were set up to hire contract workers. However, the workers were deceived and transported to foreign countries. They worked like slaves and were treated cruelly.
Having arrived at the workplaces, a myriad of problems were encountered by the Chinese workers. The greatest one is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was established in 1882. It was a very mean act that the basic rights of the overseas workers were deprived. One states that the Chinese were not allowed to be buried when they passed away in America. As a result, they have no choice but to return to their hometown. In addition, this act strengthened the desire of the Chinese to return to their hometown thanks to their traditional thought, which is to return to their roots. They crave for being back in their motherland after the establishment of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Okay, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was a very racist act that was passed against Chinese immigration to the United States. This was the first act that the United States ever passed that targeted one specific group of people. Before the Irish came, the Germans came, the French came, everyone came, and nobody ever were excluded by legislation.
In the 20th century, the North American region was developing rapidly, and both the economy and political situation were stable. That period was known as Roaring Twenties, which people highly aspired to live in the US and Canada. Besides, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed gradually in more countries afterwards. This caused most of the Chinese overseas workers to prefer to stay in the workplaces than go back to China. In addition, China was facing a tough situation in the early 20th century because of the outbreak of World War II and the Chinese Civil War. Therefore, it was not safe and very difficult for the Chinese to go back home. As a result, they were forced to stay and even settle in the working countries.
The Chinese, when they were hired and brought over here to work on the railroads, they were promised by the bosses, the railroad bosses, because they usually land in San Francisco because that's where the ships docked. So they were promised that once the railroad is built in the middle of the United States, the bosses will give them money to return back to San Francisco so that they can go home. Okay. That promise was broken. It never happened. So here you have these Chinese railroad workers stuck in the middle of the United States, wild Indians, unsettled land, people racist against them, and they have no money to go back to San Francisco to go home.
Overseas Chinese workers in 19th to 20th century always hoped that they could be buried in their hometown when they died on their long working journey. They treated it as the most important wish among their whole life, or else it would be a great misery to the family. Nevertheless, wars and social unrest had become a huge obstruction on their way back home. Years by years, the culture and minds of the Chinese have changed a lot. They started to accept emigrating and settling in foreign countries instead of living in their hometowns. Settling by self is more acceptable than returning to roots to the young generation.